Chapter 1. The Status Quo. The jarring blare of Jane's alarm clock tore her violently from a deep sleep. She fumbled in groggy confusion to silence the intolerable buzzing, not ready to surrender the peace of sleep. But mere minutes later, the alarm resumed its assault. With great reluctance and a frustrated groan, Jane dragged herself out of bed to face another dreary day. Trudging to the bathroom, she grimaced at her reflection in the harsh light. Faint but unmistakable dark circles hung below her hazel eyes, which peered back at her dull and listless. Though only 25 years old, small lines had begun to form across her forehead. "You're too young to look so worn out," she muttered to herself. She turned on the faucet and doused her face in cold water, trying in vain to wash away the perpetual exhaustion that clung to her. After throwing on an old pair of jeans and the first clean work shirt she could find, Jane made a small pot of dark coffee. The rich aroma perked her up ever so slightly as she poured a steaming mug. She then filled a bowl with food for her cat Frumpy, who trotted happily over and brushed against her legs in gratitude. "At least I have you to keep me company," Jane said, as she reached down to give him a few absent-minded pets. The drive to work was as dull and uneventful as ever. Jane sipped her hot coffee but could feel its effects diminishing before she had even arrived. As an accounting assistant at a small distribution company, her days consisted of combing through endless spreadsheets, verifying numbers and discrepancies. While the work itself was not altogether challenging, its sheer monotony wore down Jane's spirit day after lifeless day. Settling heavily into the worn chair in her cramped cubicle, Jane glanced around at the off-white walls that enclosed her. She had attempted to brighten up the space with a small potted plant on her desk, but it remained hopelessly dreary. With a resigned sigh, she logged onto her computer to begin the long day ahead. "Just power through this, then you can go home and zone out," she told herself, without conviction. But the thought of another empty evening in her apartment provided little comfort. As Jane mechanically sorted through a backlog of emails, she found her restless mind wandering. She began imagining, as she often did, how different her life could be. A job that provided a sense of purpose and fulfillment. An engaging social life, full of stimulating friends and activity. Travel, adventure, new experiences that broke up the monotony she felt trapped in. But at 25 and settled securely into her ways, she had no idea how to manifest this mythical, exciting existence. The hours crawled by at an agonizing, lethargic pace, each minute feeling like a small eternity. Jane could not focus on her work as her mind grasped desperately for some mental diversion to pass the time. She glanced repeatedly at the clock on her computer screen, willing the hands to move faster. When the clock finally granted her freedom at 5 p.m. sharp, she rose hastily, feeling at once drained yet anxious to flee. Arriving home, Jane went through the motions on autopilot. She provided Frumpy with his usual dinner, which he ate enthusiastically. Though happy to see his owner, he could not relieve the loneliness Jane felt. She picked at a frozen meal for herself, appetite dulled by the monotony of her day. She tried reading a novel, but could not invest her mind in imagined lives when her own felt so lacking. The television provided only superficial distraction from her thoughts. She flipped half-heartedly through channels before turning it off with a resigned sigh. Jane's gaze drifted aimlessly around her small but tidy apartment. She had made an attempt to brighten up the place with some simple decorations, but it remained hopelessly bland. The bare white walls and impersonal style reflected the flatness that had seeped into her life. There were no photos of loved ones, no posters or art that spoke of her interests. No signs she had much of a social life at all anymore. A creeping sadness weighed on Jane as she once again thought there must be more to life than this. At 25 years old, she felt too young to be so apathetic and weary. but she didn't know how to grasp at something better for herself. The promise of a more engaging existence felt impossibly distant. Exhausted by her complete disinterest in her own life, Jane climbed into bed early, wishing for nothing more than to let sleep transport her, at least briefly, away from her circumstances. As she drifted in and out of hazy dreams, she found herself longing for the adventure, passion, and companionship her reality lacked. But she had no idea how to manifest those yearnings hidden deep within her. Oblivious to Jane, forces outside of her control were about to set in motion a drastic turn of events.
Hey everyone, if you're enjoying these spine-chilling stories, do me a favor. Hit that like button and smash subscribe. It helps to keep the horrors coming your way. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a scare. Thanks for watching.
Chapter 2. The Complication. Monday mornings were always difficult for Jane, and this one was no exception. Her weekend had provided minimal relief from the monotonous grind of her daily routine. The hours had slipped past in a haze of household chores, solitary meals, and mindless television. Even a lunch outing with a few casual work acquaintances had left Jane feeling dissatisfied. She found she had little in common anymore with these women who seemed content with their predictable lives. Settling in at her desk, Jane tried to focus on the stack of paperwork awaiting her attention. But within an hour, she could feel her mind threatening to wander. Out of habit, she found herself glancing repeatedly at the time displayed on her computer monitor, though it barely seemed to budge. "Come on, Jane, you need this job," she muttered to herself. "Just power through." She shook her head sharply in an attempt to disrupt her malaise and tried to direct her attention back to the documents and spreadsheets laid out before her. But soon, she found herself daydreaming again about the more fulfilling existence she wished she could discover. A knock on her cubicle wall jarred Jane from her aimless thoughts. She looked up to see her manager, Charles, standing over her with an unreadable expression on his face. "Sorry if I'm interrupting," he said. "Do you have a few minutes to talk in my office?" Jane felt a knot forming in her stomach. Was she about to be reprimanded for spacing out at work? Or even worse, fired? She had no choice but to nod politely and follow Charles to his office. Charles closed the office door behind them and motioned for Jane to take a seat across from his desk. She perched nervously on the edge of the chair, trying to guess at what this meeting could be about. "Relax, Jane. You're not in any trouble," Charles said gently, seeming to sense her anxiety. "In fact, what I wanted to discuss may come as welcome news." Jane exhaled slowly, but continued looking at him with puzzlement. Where was this going? "As you know," Charles continued, "I'll be retiring at the end of next month. I know this is short notice, but I wanted to talk to you first about taking over my position as department manager." Jane's eyes widened in surprise. She had not seen this coming at all. "I think with some additional training, you'd thrive in this role," Charles explained. "You have the experience, competence, and dedication. And frankly, you've gone as far as you can here as an assistant. I'd like to see you move up and take on more responsibility." Charles looked at Jane expectantly, but she remained too stunned to respond right away. Her mind raced as she processed this sudden opportunity. Of course, a promotion would come with substantially higher pay and status in the company. As a single woman trying to pay down student loans, she could really use the extra money. And it was flattering to be recognized for her hard work. But as a manager, the already long hours would expand further, eating into her limited free time. She would be accountable for her department's entire performance and productivity. The increased pressure and responsibilities could be immense. Was climbing the corporate ladder how she wanted to spend her days? Or would it only trap her further? The impatient but earnest look on Charles's face told Jane he was awaiting an enthusiastic response. But all she could muster was a conflicted nod and murmur of gratitude before asking if she could take a day to consider the offer. Back at her desk, Jane's mind reeled. This unexpected complication had crashed abruptly into her monotonous life, threatening to tip the scales one way or another. The timid part of her wanted to clutch at the familiar status quo, but there was an undeniable appeal to doing something bold and decisive for once. The time had come for Jane to make a choice that could change the course of her life. Chapter 3: Crossing the Threshold. Jane tossed and turned all night, unable to quiet her churning thoughts enough to sleep. Charles's offer had thrust an unexpectedly difficult decision into her lap. On one hand, she could continue along the safe and predictable path she knew by accepting the promotion. The extra income would be a great help, and any change of pace from her monotonous routine seemed appealing. But alarms nagged at the back of Jane's mind. She had seen previous managers at the company work longer and longer hours under ever-growing pressure from corporate. They always looked exhausted and complained of constant stress headaches. Did she really want to sacrifice any more of her personal time and sanity for a soulless job? As the first rays of sun peeked through her bedroom curtains, Jane crawled out of bed, feeling unsettled. Her morning routine did little to shake the uncertainty that clouded her mind. As she pulled into the office parking lot, she realized she was no closer to making a decision than the day before. Settling heavily at her desk, Jane tried to distract herself by sifting half-heartedly through emails and paperwork. But she found herself reading the same sentences over and over, comprehension eluding her restless brain. A tap on her cubicle wall made Jane flinch. She looked up to see Charles leaning over her partition, his face inquisitive. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "Just wanted to check in and see if you've had time to think about our discussion yesterday." Jane hesitated, buying herself time by taking a long sip from her coffee mug. She knew Charles would not be satisfied until he got a firm answer. Setting down her mug, Jane spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. "I'm truly grateful for the opportunity," she began, "and for you seeing such potential in me." She trailed off, dropping her gaze from Charles's attentive eyes as she gathered her nerve. Looking back up, she continued, "As I've thought through this decision, however, I realized something. While I know I would succeed as manager, deep down I'm yearning for my work to feel more meaningful. At this point in my life, I believe pursuing a leadership role here would take me farther away from that goal." Jane held her breath as Charles furrowed his brow, seemingly turning over her words in his mind. She couldn't recall the time she had asserted her wishes so directly at work. After a pause that felt endless, Charles exhaled and his expression softened into a look of understanding. "If this promotion doesn't align with what will truly motivate you, then it would be foolish to accept it," he said. "I appreciate you taking time to consider this opportunity carefully and being honest with me." Relieved that Charles didn't seem upset, Jane thanked him again for considering her. As he retreated from her cubicle, an unexpected sensation of optimism washed over her. She had taken the first step toward carving out a life driven by her values and desires instead of just passively accepting each day as it came. For the first time in years, Jane felt a kernel of excitement about what lay ahead. The next few weeks passed in a blur as Jane rolled off more and more work to Charles to prepare for his fast-approaching retirement date. Co-workers often dropped by her desk now, shaking their heads in disbelief that anyone would turn down such a coveted promotion. But doubt did not creep its way back into Jane's mind even once. She knew with full conviction that she was making the right decision for herself. On Charles's final day, the department gathered to say farewell and raise a toast in his honor. As co-workers laughed and reminisced over cake, Jane noticed Charles beckoning her off to the side. "I know you'll do great things," he said, giving her shoulder an encouraging squeeze. "This is just the first step. Stay true to yourself, Jane, and the rest will follow. With that, he was off, leaving Jane feeling like she was standing on the precipice of a new life. The safety net of all things familiar was slipping away, but she was ready to meet whatever lay ahead. After one last glance around the office that had encompassed the past 5 years of her life, Jane grabbed her belongings and walked towards her future with a smile on her face. Chapter 4: A New World. Jane took a deep breath as she turned the key in the lock of her apartment door. The space already felt different somehow, even though nothing had physically changed yet. Dropping her bags by the entrance, she let out an enormous sigh of relief. She had done it, taken the immense step of leaving her stable job behind to pursue a new creative path. After greeting an enthusiastic frumpy at her feet, Jane brewed a fresh cup of coffee and sank into her warm but comfortable couch. As the initial euphoria of quitting began to fade, the practical implications of her decision came more sharply into focus. Pursuing freelance writing meant giving up a steady paycheck. She would have to drastically trim her expenses and budget carefully to get by on irregular income. Jane booted up her laptop to take stock of her financial standing and assess how long her savings could sustain her. The numbers were tight, but she could make it work for several months if she was frugal. She would also need to secure health insurance. Thankfully, she had no outstanding debts aside from a remaining balance on her student loan. Setting her finances temporarily aside, Jane opened a new Word document and stared at the blinking cursor, considering what to write first. She felt eager to make progress on the novel concept she had been mulling over for years. But an immediate onslaught of self-doubt clouded her motivation. Did she have any business thinking she could write a novel without formal training? And even if she managed to finish a draft through sheer willpower, the odds of getting it published seemed infinitesimal. Jane worried that gnawing sense of futility might become her constant companion in this new, unpredictable chapter. Shaking off the negative thoughts, Jane pulled out a notebook and started jotting down all her worries and insecurities. Just getting them out of her head and onto paper seemed to release some of their oppressive power. She reminded herself that, of course, this transition would be frightening. She was stepping into the complete unknown. But that was also the point. She had been dying for her life to feel less predictable and stagnant. Jane turned back to her laptop with renewed resolve. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she summoned the opening lines of her story from some deep, vulnerable place within. Typing tentatively at first, and then, with growing confidence, Jane became engrossed in fleshing out the world and characters she had imagined so often over the years. The winter sun had begun to set by the time she finally came up for air. Reading back the pages she had written, Jane allowed a proud smile to emerge. This was nowhere near a polished or complete first chapter, but it was a start, one she finally had the freedom to pursue. Over the next several weeks, Jane settled into a routine split between writing in the mornings and querying magazines and websites with article pitches in the afternoons. Rejections still stung when they rolled in, but Jane was slowly growing accustomed to them as an inevitable part of this path. Late one night, as Jane sat editing her novel draft, she came across a pivotal conversation between two characters that suddenly struck her as forced and inauthentic. She ended up deleting the entire exchange in frustration. How could she think she could ever get an entire book published when she couldn't even construct realistic dialogue? Slamming her laptop closed, Jane admitted exhaustion was exaggerating her doubts. Reminding herself that writing an entire novel was not something she could master overnight lifted her spirits. She prepared for bed, proud of the hard work she had put in so far. Even on the hardest days, she did not miss her old office job one bit. Jane felt certain that together with determination, her passion would be enough to overcome whatever obstacles arose. Curled under the covers that night, Jane's mind swirled with anticipation about where this new path would lead her. The future felt malleable and brimming with potential once again. She had taken the immense leap into the unknown. Now it was up to her to make the most of it. As she drifted off to sleep, Jane felt content in the knowledge that whatever lay ahead, it would no longer be the safe but unsatisfying status quo she left behind. Chapter 5. External Obstacles. Jane jolted awake in the dark, momentarily confused about what had startled her. Then she heard the shrill ring of her phone on the nightstand. Fumbling to grab it, she saw an unfamiliar number displayed on the screen. Her pulse quickened. In her line of freelance writing work, late-night calls were never a good sign. "Hello?" Jane answered tentatively. The brash voice on the other end belonged to Ethan, an editor she had pitched articles to numerous times over the past months. He never responded to her pitches, leaving Jane to assume he simply wasn't interested in working with her. "Glad I caught you," Ethan said briskly. "I have an assignment that's perfect for you. It's time sensitive, so we need to move quick. When can you get me an initial draft?" Still disoriented, it took a moment for Jane to process his rapid-fire words. Ethan wanted to give her an assignment? She scrambled for a notebook and pen to jot down the details as he spoke. It was a short human interest piece for a regional magazine focused on inspiring stories of perseverance. Jane assured Ethan she would start on it immediately and get him a draft by the end of the week. As she hung up the phone, adrenaline coursed through Jane's veins. She had been hoping for this big break, but now that it was here, she couldn't afford any missteps. Failure would undo months of hard work establishing herself. Over the next few days, Jane became completely absorbed in interviewing sources and writing the article. She barely left her desk, much to Frumpy's dismay. The only breaks she took were to brew more coffee or walk frenzied laps around her apartment when she needed to dislodge writer's block. Late Thursday evening, bleary-eyed and exhausted, Jane typed the final sentence. After obsessively triple-checking for errors, she emailed the draft off to Ethan just before midnight, heart pounding as she hit send. She had poured everything into this piece. Now, it was out of her hands. Jane knew she should try to get some sleep, but anxiety kept her wired. She tried fruitlessly reading a book to unwind before giving up. As she stared aimlessly at infomercials, doubts crept in. What if her draft wasn't good enough? What if Ethan had changed his mind about hiring her? The silence over the next few days was agony. A week after turning in the draft, Jane returned home after grocery shopping to find her phone flooded with missed calls and texts from Ethan. Hands shaking, she called him back right away. Ethan's irritated tone made her stomach sink. "Your draft is a mess," he said without preamble. "Rambling, no consistent narrative, arc. Did you even proofread this?" His complaints went on as each stingingly accurate criticism pierced Jane. "I don't have time to hold your hand," Ethan concluded briskly. "Get this on track, or we'll need to part ways." Before Jane could respond, he hung up. Crushed, Jane sat staring blankly at her discarded groceries. All her work and Ethan couldn't stand what she produced. She knew deep down her skills weren't refined enough yet for a professional magazine. Imposter syndrome flooded over Jane, tempting her to give up on writing entirely. She considered calling Ethan back to resign from the assignment, but hesitation held her back. If she walked away now, it would be a self-fulfilling prophecy about her inability to make it. With a surge of defiance, Jane resolved to take Ethan's feedback and improve the piece, proving her dedication. Over the next few weeks, Jane channeled all her frustration into overhauled rewrites. She dissected the plot, strengthened character arcs, and tightened the language. The night she resubmitted the draft, Jane felt a wary sense of confidence. She had risen to meet this challenge rather than shying away. As she finally crawled into bed, exhaustion quickly overtook her. What mattered was that she kept learning and improving. The rest she had no control over. Jane awoke the next morning to an email from Ethan. Holding her breath, she opened it and read his brief note. Good save. Piece is polished now. I'll submit it for the next issue. Jane raised both fists in victory, whooping so loudly a disgruntled frumpy darted under the couch. She had cleared this first major hurdle. Her career was still newborn and fragile, but if she kept persevering through self-doubt, Jane knew each success would bolster her resilience. For today, the satisfaction of proving herself was reward enough. Chapter 6, Internal Obstacles. Jane leaned back from her desk, stretching her arms overhead and wincing as her cramped muscles unknotted. She had been hunched over her laptop for hours, desperately trying to make headway on the novel that had stalled. But no matter how she tried to rearrange paragraphs and dredge her mind for the right phrasing, the scenes felt flat and lifeless. Discouraged, she glanced at the time in the corner of the screen. It was past 9 p.m. already. No wonder her brain felt fried. Jane debated calling it a night, but an obsessive inner voice needled her to keep pushing. She had made the leap to writing full-time. She couldn't afford to be complacent. With a sigh, Jane turned back to the manuscript. Cursor still blinked accusingly on the same sentence she had been rereading for an eternity. She knew nothing more would get accomplished in this state. But the nagging compulsion to force more mediocre pages out gripped her. Just one more chapter. Jane muttered half-heartedly as she racked her mind for where the plot should go next. She had lost track of her overall vision. Frustration mounting, she allowed herself a brief fantasy of opening her laptop in the morning to find beautifully polished paragraphs had magically appeared overnight. Jane shook her head, annoyed by her own defeatist attitude. This was the life she had chosen because it aligned with her values. Some days the writing flowed easily, the hours passing in glorious oblivion. On the hard days, she had to keep faith that she would grow stronger for having weathered them. Still, though, doubts crept into Jane's tired mind. She thought of acquaintances from her old office job who were now buying houses, getting married, taking vacations. Meanwhile, she could barely scrape enough article assignments together to pay a month's rent. Imposter syndrome flooded over Jane, tempting her to abandon this tenuous writing career before she failed spectacularly. Jane's gaze landed on a handwritten note stuck to the corner of her laptop screen. Stay true to yourself. Charles's parting words of wisdom from her last day at the office. His vote of confidence had propelled her through the early unknown days of writing full-time. Rereading it now helped drain some of the self-doubt from Jane's mind. Looking at the time again, Jane resolved to call it a night. As she brushed her teeth before bed, she made an effort to replace her negative thinking with intention. Even if progress was slow, each small gain brought her closer to her goals. If she kept writing from her soul rather than external expectations, she had to trust her skills would continue developing. Jane settled into bed, relieved to give her weary mind some rest. As she drifted off, she focused on conjuring the passion that had pulled her down this path to begin with. Some days, that fire burned brightly, making her feel alive. On the hard days, she had to stoke the embers and just keep persisting. Fortified with renewed motivation, Jane slept peacefully. The obstacles were expected. What mattered was how she responded. Chapter 7, Dark Moment. Jane's eyes flew open into darkness, her sleep shattered by a crash from the living room. Heart pounding, she lay frozen in bed, straining to make sense of what she heard. Had she imagined it? No. Now she caught the unmistakable sound of a floorboard creaking under cautious footsteps. A tremor of fear ran through Jane's body. Someone was in her apartment. As silently as possible, Jane slid open her nightstand drawer and grabbed the pepper spray she kept there. She considered making a run for the front door, but the intruder was already roaming between her and the only exit. Going on the offensive was her only option. Jane moved stealthily down the hall towards the living room, pressing herself flat against the wall. She could see only the outline of a figure silhouetted against the windows. Taking a deep breath, she leapt out, aiming her pepper spray right at the shadowy intruder. "Damn it, Jane!" a familiar voice yelled as the figure recoiled from the spray. Flicking on the lights, Jane illuminated the pained face of her friend David. Shocked, she dropped her outstretched arms. "What the hell, David?" Jane shouted back through a surge of adrenaline. "Why didn't you call before coming over?" David grimaced, dabbing at his eyes with his sleeve. "Wanted to surprise you for your birthday tomorrow," he muttered, gesturing to a gift bag abandoned on the floor. Jane exhaled, her racing heart slowly calming. In the chaos, she had forgotten her birthday was coming up. Trust impulsive David to nearly give her a heart attack trying to surprise her. After profusely apologizing and getting David an ice pack for his eyes, Jane made them each a cup of tea to soothe their rattled nerves. They recounted the terrifying encounter, able to laugh about it now. Jane felt a rush of gratitude that she hadn't mistakenly pepper-sprayed an actual intruder willing to hurt her. Despite the traumatic start, spending the morning of her birthday with her oldest friend lifted Jane's spirits. She hadn't seen much of David lately, between his busy job and new girlfriend. Catching up reminded Jane of more carefree times, starting out in the city, when weekday misadventures were their norm. An envelope landed in Jane's lap, jolting her from reminiscing. "That's the real gift," David said. "The gift bag is just for laughs." Jane opened the card to find a generous birthday check inside. She started to protest, but he waved her off. "I know you've been struggling. Put it towards the novel or something fun." Impulsively, Jane threw her arms around David in a fierce hug. His support of her writing aspirations since college meant everything. She vowed to use part of the money, taking him to dinner at the lavish Italian restaurant they could never afford as students. After David left, a melancholy settled over Jane. She surveyed her quiet, empty apartment, the only plans for her birthday, a video call with her mom later. Her isolation had intensified pursuing writing full-time. The long, solitary days left her craving connection and adventure. For the first time in a while, Jane felt the sharp pang of loneliness. Shaking off the funk, Jane grabbed the gift bag David left and pulled out outrageous sequined miniskirt. She had to laugh, imagining his misguided thought process, buying it. Trying on the eye-catching skirt, Jane had an impulse to get all dressed up and go immerse herself among people tonight. Stepping out of her apartment later, feeling glamorous and free, Jane took a deep breath of the crisp night air. She had weathered heavy doubts and setbacks to follow her passion. But sometimes, in the struggle, she forgot to enjoy the journey. Tonight called for celebrating herself and all she had survived. Linking arms with her glittering reflection in the subway window, Jane ventured off to find adventure. Chapter 8. Climax. Jane's heels clicked against the sidewalk as she hurried down the dimly lit street. The neighborhoods were growing unfamiliar in her aimless wandering to prolong the celebratory night. She should have turned back home already, but restless impulse pushed her on. Crossing to avoid a noisy group that had just spilled from a bar, Jane accidentally turned down an empty side street. The sound of raucous laughter faded abruptly into unsettling silence. Unease prickled the back of Jane's neck as she noticed the buildings here were abandoned, their windows dark. Picking up her pace, Jane rummaged in her purse for the can of mace attached to her keychain. Just as her hand closed around the cold metal cylinder, she heard slow footsteps echo behind her. Her chest tightened. Before she could react, a figure emerged from the shadows. "Hey, beautiful," Where you rushing off to? His leering words slurred together slightly. Jane's grip on the mace canister tightened as she backed away slowly. She took in the man's imposing size, his cold expression that held no indication of warmth or humanity. There would be no reasoning with him. When Jane made it obvious she wasn't going to respond, the man's mocking smile dropped into a look of rage. He lunged toward her, but stumbled over a broken chunk of pavement. Seizing the opportunity, Jane turned and fled down the sidewalk. The footsteps pounded after her again, closer this time. Jane spared a panicked glance back. The man was staggering, but pursued her relentlessly, primal instinct having taken over. Up ahead, Jane spotted a 24-hour laundromat, its fluorescent lights glowing like a beacon through the darkness. She flung herself through the propped open door into the comforting hum of the empty laundromat. Collapsing onto a plastic chair, she struggled to catch her breath and stop shaking. Under the harsh lights, Jane stared down at the sequined skirt that had made her feel so free and alive earlier that night. Now the glittering fabric just mocked her, a symbol of what drew predatory eyes. Hot tears of anger, fear, and shame welled in her eyes. She ripped the stupid skirt off right there in the laundromat, suddenly unable to bear wearing it a second longer. Jane sat clutching the balled-up fabric in her fists, raw emotions crashing over her in waves. She thought about calling David or the police, but she just felt numb. All she wanted was to feel safe in her own bed. The subway platform was deserted when Jane emerged gratefully from the underground tunnels back in her neighborhood. She hurried down the final block, fatigue hitting her. Inside the familiar walls of home, Jane finally allowed herself to fully break down. She had just wanted one night of letting loose and adventure. Instead, that Navi desire had almost cost her. Jane's trembling anger was directed inward now. If she had just made smarter choices, been less reckless. A tiny voice broke through her self-blame. It's not your fault. Jane tried to quiet that voice of compassion, but it persisted. She had done nothing to invite being attacked. The fault lay with the man who chose to prey on her weakness. Exhausted by the emotional roller coaster, Jane dragged herself to bed as the first light of dawn glowed outside. Despite her swirling thoughts, she quickly slipped into a dreamless sleep, her psyche too battered to face further processing yet. For now, she just needed rest. Chapter 9, Twist. Jane slowly surfaced to consciousness, clawing her way from the fog of deep exhaustion. Even cocooned in the warmth of her bed, she could sense something wasn't right. As full awareness hit, the memories of last night crashed over her, the giddy freedom spiraling into terror when she found herself preyed upon. Jane squeezed her eyes shut, willing it all to have been a nightmare. But the truth still waited when she opened them again. Peeling herself from the tangled sheets, Jane stood under a near scalding shower, as if she could wash away the stain of violation she felt. As much as she wanted to crawl back into the oblivion of sleep, she made herself follow the comforting routine of brewing coffee and making breakfast. The familiar tasks settled her nerves slightly. Jane had just forced down the last bites of her toast when an aggressive pounding on the front door made her jump. She approached cautiously, bracing for the worst. Looking through the peephole, she sagged in relief and annoyance. Only David would show up at her place this early, pounding like the police. As soon as she opened the door, David's concerned questions came rapid fire. Why'd you leave the club alone so late? What happened with that creep? In her frazzled state, Jane had completely forgotten texting David the night before about almost being attacked. Now here he was, in protective mode, ready to dispense brotherly outrage on her behalf. I'm okay, I promise, Jane assured, guiding him to sit on the couch before recounting the terrifying encounter in full. David listened intently, cursing under his breath. his knee bouncing anxiously. "This city is full of messed up people," David said once she finished. "You can't be wandering around alone at night." Jane bristled at the inadvertent condemnation in his tone. "Believe me, I've learned that lesson," she said tightly. They sat in tense silence for a minute. Jane knew he was just worried for her, but she didn't want to lecture him. David ran a hand through his hair roughly. "Sorry, Jane, I didn't to come off judgmental," he said with a sigh. "I just wish I could have protected you from having to go through that." He leaned in suddenly and wrapped her in a hug. Jane exhaled, feeling her irritation dissipate. "I know. Me too," she said softly. "But it happened, and now we move forward." They sat together quietly for a while, taking comfort in each other's presence. Jane felt profoundly grateful to not be weathering this alone. Over the next week, Jane found herself jumpy, walking anywhere alone. She dutifully stuck to well-lit main roads. The fear slowly lessened its grip on her, but a new weariness remained. She was warier now, a little more withdrawn into herself. Sitting down one night to work on her novel draft, Jane found words flowing out about a character recovering from trauma, their sense of safety and trust in the world shattered. She wrote page after page, tension releasing through her fingertips. By the time she stumbled off to bed, she felt lighter. Dark times had fueled her art, but not defined her. On a calm Saturday, spent lazing in the park with David, Jane found the laughter and easy conversation returning. The lingering shadow cast by that night was slowly receding as life resumed its rhythm. She would always carry the scar of it, but refused to hand over power by living in fear. Peace restored in her world, Jane dove back into writing with renewed passion. She was reminded there was so much yet to learn about herself and life. Vulnerability came hand in hand with being alive. As she reached boldly for each new day's potential, the future unfurled brightly once again. Exhausted from her turbulent emotions, Jane crawls into bed early and quickly falls into a deep sleep. Hours later, she is jolted awake by the sound of pounding at her front door. Looking through the peephole, she sees two police officers standing in the hall. Jane opens the door hesitantly. Before she can speak, the officers identify her as Jane Smith and say they need to bring her to the station right away concerning the assault and suspected murder of a man last night. Jane is completely stunned, having no memory of committing such a horrible crime. She convinces the officers there must be some mistake, but they firmly place her under arrest and into a squad car. At the police station, Jane is interrogated by a detective who shows her security footage from last night that clearly depicts a woman appearing to be Jane following and attacking a man in the street. Jane insists it must be someone impersonating her, though even she starts to doubt herself. Chapter 10, Return Home. Jane paced the cramped jail cell, her mind racing. Less than 24 hours ago, police arrived at her door, accusing her of assault and murder. The security footage from that night unmistakably showed a woman identical to Jane stalking and attacking a man, but Jane had zero recollection of this horrific crime. During relentless questioning, Jane racked her brain, trying to recall any details about her actions that night. But everything after arriving home was a blank. Exhausted and overwhelmed, she had begun questioning her own sanity. The public defender assigned to Jane reviewed the damning evidence piling up. Jane needed to provide concrete proof that she was innocent if they had any hope of beating this. But no alibi or excuse came to mind. As Jane sat holding her head in her hands, a brief flash suddenly appeared the face of a young woman passing her on the street, an eerie mirror image. In a rush, Jane realized there was a doppelganger out there impersonating her. This evil twin must have committed the crime that she was now accused of. Jane urged her lawyer to obtain any surveillance footage from around the attack location that night. After days of desperate waiting, he arrived with a breakthrough security video showing Jane's lookalike trailing the victim. This irrefutable evidence corroborated the twin theory. At a pressured meeting with the prosecutor, Jane and her lawyer presented the footage proving two identical women existed. Though reluctant to admit fault, the prosecutor could not refute such hard evidence. Begrudgingly, all charges against Jane were dropped. Jane took her first breath as a free woman, utterly exhausted. She had narrowly avoided imprisonment for a heinous murder, but the mysterious doppelganger was still out there and newly aware that Jane posed a threat to her sinister plans. The end